Hello, students. Good morning to all. I am DR.S.R.BHARGAVA Associate Professor, Department of English. I am going to teach you the important topic of today, that is based on the characterization of Jane Eyre. She has been presented as a heroine of the novel. The character of Jane Eyre, as we know that she is presented as the fictional heroine of Charlotte Bronte's novel 1847, and the name of the novel and the name of the heroine both are same. Jane, an orphan, is employed as a governess, becomes romantically involved with her employer, the mysterious and moody Edward Rochester. Joan presented as an orphan, and she has been presented with the master Rochester, whom she gets married, and she becomes a governess in the life. Jane is noted for her dependability, strong-mindedness, and individualism. These qualities make her unforgettable. She is prepared to face near starvation. Starvation means death of hunger. She faces this condition rather than enter a bigamous marriage, and she remains true to her Christian faith throughout. She remains loyal, faithful to Christian religion. The author deliberately created Jane as an unglamorous figure, in contrast to conventional heroines of fiction, possibly part autograph. Jane is presented as a unglamorous, without any splendor, and she is presented as a personal element in the form of writer's life. Jane has retained a strong influence on literature, especially romantic and feminist writing. The novelist has been successful presenting her view of life in feminism. Jane Eyre is an orphan living unhappily with her relations, the Reeds. Mrs. Reed only keeps Jane on because it was the dying wish of her late husband, Jane maternal uncle. Reed's family was not happy with Jane. They like to keep her away from their sight, and they decided to make her ignorant, aloof, alone. The Reeds only resent, neglect, and abuse Jane and justify it by saying she is charity case. They regard her as a case of charity, and she should be grateful for any care. In addition, Jane is not a pretty child, nor is her demeanor sweet. She keenly feels the injustice of her treatment. After a fight with her old cousin, Jane is locked into the Red Room, which she believes is haunted, and goes into a swoon. This is something of a catalyst. Mrs. Reed decides to get Jane out of the house for the benefit of her children. There takes place a fight between Johan and Jane. Though John was at blame for his work, and she was innocent, but she was considered as a case of charity. She was thought to be out. Mrs. Reed sends Jane to Lowood Hall, a school for other charity girls where they will learn to be governess. Now Jane Eyre is sent to Lowood School for the study, though she was going to become a governess. At Lowood, Jane is desperate to be loved and accepted, but learns from her friend Helen Burns to be more patient and seeks solace in prayer and her own conscience. Helen Burns dies, and Jane weathers a typhoid epidemic at the school. Now at Lowood School, Jane has a friend, nice friend, Helen Burns, who helps her, teaches her to become patient, but she dies untimely. Over time, Jane gets a good education and becomes a particular friend of Miss Mary Temple, the school's principal. After a few years of teaching at Lowood without once returning to the Reed's house, Gateshead, Jane decides it is time to go out into the world. Now Jane comes in contact with the principal, who was Miss Temple, and she helped her in everything. She seeks work as a governess and is employed to Thornfield Hall to care for a solitary orphan Adele. Jane goes to Thornfield, learns about the distant master, Mr. Rochester, starts to teach his ward, although she finds Adele to be less than stellar student. Now she becomes governess to the student, and she takes care. One morning, when Jane is out for a walk, she meets a mysterious man. When his horse slips and he falls. This is Mr. Rochester. Jane and Rochester are immediately interested in each other. This is a turning point in her life that Mr. Rochester is introduced as a person falling from the horse and his life is saved by Jane. So they come in contact and start their feelings for each other. She is fascinated by his rough, craggy, dark appearance as well as his abrupt, almost rude manners, which she thinks are easier to handle than polite flattery. He is very interested in figuring out how Zen is herself, comparing her to an elf errant spirit and admiring her unusual strength and stubbornness. Though he is a rough person, yet Jane likes him because she thinks that his roughness is no more than a thing to be solved in politeness. Rochester quickly learns that he can rely on Jane in crisis. One evening, Jane finds Rochester asleep in his bed with all the curtains and bedclothes on fire. She puts out the flames and rescues him. She again saves the life of Rochester when he is surrounded with the flames of fire and she extinguishes the fire for her interest. Jane and Rochester find that they can have interesting and in that depth conversation. Both fall steadily in love with each other. However, Rochester soon invited some of his acquaintances to Thornfield, including the beautiful Blanche Ingram. Rochester lets Blanche flirt with him constantly in front of Jane to make her jealous and encourages rumors that he is engaged to Blanche. Now there comes a chaos, disorder in her life when Rochester flirts with Blanche and Jane Eyre becomes jealous in this manner. During the week-long party, a man named Richard Mason shows up and Rochester seems afraid of him. At night, Mason sneaks up to the third floor and somehow gets stabbed and beaten. The Mason is presented. Rochester asks Jane to tend Richard Mason's wounds secretly while he fetches the doctor. The next morning, before the guests find out what happened, Rochester sneaks Mason out of the house. Before Jane can discover more about the mysterious situation, she gets a message that her aunt Reed is very sick and is asking for her. Jane, forgiving Mrs. Reed for mistreating her when she was a child, goes back to take care of her dying aunt. When Jane returns to Thornfield, Blanche and her friends are gone, and Jane realizes how attached she is to Mr. Rochester. So there comes a turning point also in life that Mrs. Reed is informed to be very sick and she has to go there, but she has to about lose Rochester in the manner. Although he lets her think for a little longer that he is going to marry Blanche. Eventually Rochester stops teasing Jane and proposes to her. She blissfully accepts. Now again she is closer to Rochester. On the day Jane's wedding, during the church ceremony, two men show up claiming that Rochester is already married. Rochester admits that he is married to another woman, but tries to justify his attempt to marry Jane by taking them all to see his wife. Mrs. Rochester in Bertha's Mason, the mad woman in the attic who tried to burn Rochester to death in his bed, stabbed and beat her own brother Richard Mason, and who has been doing other creepy things at night. Rochester was tricked into marrying Bertha 15 years ago in Jamaica by his father, who wanted to marry for money and did not tell him that insanity ran in Bertha's family. Rochester tried to live with Bertha as husband and wife, but she was too horrible, so he locked her up at Thornfield with a nursemaid graceful. Now the Bertha house and other mason type people come in life. Meanwhile, he traveled around Europe for 10 years trying to forget Bertha and keeping various mistresses. Adele Warren's Jane's student is the daughter of one of these mistresses, though she may not be Rochester's daughter. Eventually, he got tired of his lifestyle, came home to England, and fell in love with them. After explaining all this, that he was not only really married because his relationship with Bertha wasn't real marriage. He wants Jane to go and live with him in France, where they can pretend to be married couple and act like husband and wife. Jane refuses to be his next mistress and runs away before she is tempted to agree. Jane travels in direction away from Thornfield, having no money. She almost starves to death before being taken in by the Rivers family, who live at Moore's house near a town called Morton. The Rivers siblings Diana, Mary, and St. John are about Jane's age and well educated, but somehow poor. They take wholeheartedly to Jane, who has taken the pseudonym Jane Elliot so that Mr. Rochester can't find her. Jane wants to earn her keep, so St. John arranges her for her to become the teacher in a village girls' school. When Jane's uncle Mr. Eyre dies and leaves his fortune to his niece, it turns out to the Rivers siblings are actually Jane's cousins and she shares her inheritance with the other three. St. John, who is devoted clergyman, wants to be more than Jane's cousin. He admires Jane's work ethic and asks her to marry him, learn Hindustani and go out with him to India on long-term missionary trip. So St. John comes in her life. Jane is tempted because she thinks she is be good at it and that it would be an interesting life and she would be doing God's work. Still she refuses because she knows that she doesn't love St. John and he doesn't love her back. He just believes that Jane would make a good missionary wife because of her skills. To top it off, St. John actually loves a different girl named Rosamond Oliver, but he won't let her himself admit it because he thinks she should make an unsuitable wife for a missionary. Jane offers to go to India with him, but just as his cousin and co-worker, not as his wife. St. John won't give up and keeps pressuring Jane to marry him. Just as she is about to give in, she imagines Mr. Rochester's voice calling her name. The next morning, Jane leaves Moore House and goes back to Thornfield to find out what's going on with Mr. Rochester. She finds out that Mr. Rochester searched for men everywhere. When he couldn't find her, sent everyone else away from the house and shut him alone. After this, Bertha set the house on fire one night and burned it to the ground. Rochester rescued all the servants and tried to save Bertha, but she committed suicide and was injured. Now Rochester has lost an eye and hand and is blind in the remaining eye. Jane goes to Mr. Rochester and offers to take care of him as his nurse or housekeeper. He asks her to marry him and they have a quiet wedding. And after 2 years of marriage, Rochester gradually gets his sight back, enough to see their firstborn son and adopted Adele Warrens. So this is the character of Jane Eyre, who started her career as an orphan, developed with the help of the school principal, Mr. Rochester, Miss Temple, Helen Burns, and other people. But she was neglected in the Reed's family, so she remembers those bitter days also, and now she feels happy that after hurdles, she got success in getting Mr. Rochester as her husband, and she spent her remaining time of life in a very convenient, comfortable manner. Thanks students, you have understood the chapter thoroughly.